Greetings, Jelly Spoons, and welcome back to another episode of Monday Madness, the Monday show where I talk about anything and everything, and today we are back on Swan Lake, as I promised we would be. Now, I've already done one video about Swan Lake where I made these trousers, and I showed you the process of making those, and a little bit of behind the scenes when I filmed in them. They made me incredibly happy, it was great, and then a couple of weeks later, I got to go and see the show on the UK tour. Super amazing, just as fantastic as ever, but it did get me thinking, and I was thinking about the story and the plot, and, well, that's how I came up with today's video. A ridiculously deep dive into the story of Swan Lake. Before we begin, I do want to do a quick trigger and content warning. This is going to be quite a dark video at certain points, so these are the topics to look out for, and if you're not ready to hear about them, skip this video for now and come back if you want to. Mental illness, mental health, suicide, both attempted and successful, manipulation, violence, death, murder, killing, torture to a certain extent, experimental treatments, asylums, neglect, and abuse. So if you're not ready to listen to any of those topics, maybe skip this video for now and come back at a later time. But for those of you who do want to stick around, thank you very much. And let's dive into this probably quite long video. There are so many different ways to view this story. Every time I have watched it, every time I've talked to someone else who has watched it, we've come up with different ideas. So I've put a lot of these together and I've come up with 3 scenarios. So 3 different ways of viewing this story. I'm going to dive into all 3 of them individually and some of their branching narratives and different directions they can go. And then you can decide which one you believe and let me know in the comments down below. But first up, what is Matthew Bourne Swan Lake? What is it about? Where did it come from? And what is the plot? Matthew Bourne Swan Lake is celebrating its 30th birthday this year, 2025, having first premiered in 1995 at the Sadler's Wells Theatre in London. It is the longest running ballet in the West End and on Broadway. It has gone on to huge success, doing worldwide tours being performed all over the globe, including a tour right now in 2025 while this video is being filmed. It was and is innovative and bold, shocking audiences when it first premiered, as Matthew Bourne cast the roles of the swans with male dancers and not the traditional female cast. Also, as the role of the prince was kept, this meant that the love story is depicted by 2 male dancers, making it a striking piece of LGBT theatre. This was a little divisive at the time, with Bourne saying in an interview that we had people walking out when we first did it, usually men when the prince and the swan started dancing. A few men would get up and walk out, but thankfully this was not the general vibe, as the show grew immense popularity and has gone on to roaring success. And now I'm going to take you through the plot of Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake. Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake starts with a young prince having a nightmare about a swan, and then his mother, the queen, comes in but does not comfort him. She keeps a distance, maintaining distance even when her son reaches for her. We follow the prince as his monotonous days continue. He grows up following routine and events with his mother, but he's unhappy and constantly kept at more than arm's distance. No real touch or care from his mother, or indeed anyone. The private secretary keeps an eye on the queen and the prince, and so the years roll by. The queen is prone to taking lovers, and still the prince is left uncomforted and fairly alone. One day, a girl in pink arrives at the palace, determined to get his attention. After several attempts, she is successful and very touchy and engaging. The queen disapproves, but the prince seems to enjoy her company as maybe a breath of fresh air, and he brings her to a royal outing at the theatre. Things go poorly, however, and the girl in pink does not behave in a manner the queen demands, and afterwards the prince stands before a mirror in his bedroom, alone again and disappointed. As he starts to drink sorrowfully, the queen arrives, and he begs her for comfort, which again she denies him. After a struggle and a desperate plea from the prince, which in his hurt state turns slightly manic as he blocks his mother from leaving the room, the queen leaves. The prince continues to drink and then leaves the palace and heads to Swank Bar. There, he sees his girlfriend, the girl in pink, dancing with another man. He tries to talk to her, but after being rejected by the queen and a terrible night at the theatre, she doesn't seem keen to reconcile. The prince continues to drink, and the private secretary, disguised somewhat, who is also there, watches him, and hands over a lot of cash to the man the girl in pink is dancing with. Soon, a fight breaks out between the prince and the prince is thrown out of the bar, where a group of press snap photos of him. As he lays in the dark street, he dances a mournful solo. The bar begins to empty, and as the prince watches, the girl in pink is greeted by the private secretary, who hands her money as well. The prince decides not to follow her, and so is left all alone once again. The prince then looks up and sees a swan from the bar poster taking flight. Deciding what to do now, he runs off. He arrives in a park, and spotting the lake, he scrawls a note on a scrap of paper he finds in a bin and wades out into the water, but he's interrupted by the appearance of the swan. The swan and the prince begin to dance, with the swan keeping away every time the prince draws near, but the pair continue to dance. Soon, more swans arrive, and the prince is in awe of them. As they continue on, the swan and the prince gradually grow closer until they are touching and dancing almost as one. But then, all in a breath, the swans are gone. The prince is left alone, but this time he is jubilant. He takes down the note and embraces an old lady, kissing her, who had arrived to feed the swans at dawn. The prince then runs back to the palace, seeming light and happy. Then we have the royal ball scene, where the girlfriend and many others try to dance with the prince. The queen is still maintaining distance between herself and her son, but then, suddenly, the stranger arrives. He reminds the prince of the swan, and he stares. Everyone seems to be struck by the stranger's majesty. He commands attention and dances with everyone, from the princesses and guests to the waiters, the girlfriend, and then the queen. The prince manages to cut in and he dances with the stranger, still uncertain whether this really is the swan, and the pair's dance becomes intimate and filled with tension. However, the stranger vanishes, leaving the prince alone again and doubting his sanity a little. The ball goes on, and as the prince watches, the stranger draws a line of ash down his forehead, making himself look like the swan. This almost soothes the prince until once again the stranger begins to dance with the queen and the prince runs away. When he returns, feeling mocked by everyone around him, the prince attempts to challenge the stranger, but the stranger seems to deny knowing him at all. As the stranger becomes closer to the queen, the prince pulls out a gun, but before he can fire, the private secretary shoots first. This does not hit the prince, but the girlfriend, who ran to him. The prince is cast out, while the stranger comforts the queen. We next see the prince in a white room, where the prince sees his mother, the queen, and the private secretary enter, followed by a group of nurses, all with his mother's face. He is subject to several treatments, which all seem horrifying, and then put to bed. As he sleeps, the swans emerge all around him, but he wakes up, reaching out, and they vanish. The prince is confused and shaken. He searches all around, and then the swan emerges from the bed, wounded and exhausted. The swan takes the prince into his arms / under his protective wing, but then the other swans arrive again. They aggressively attack, and the swan tries to defend the prince. Soon the prince appears to have been killed, and the swan drives the others back and mourns the fallen prince, who miraculously gets back up. But then the swans attack once again, and this time they destroy the swan, who vanishes. Horrified and heartbroken, the prince falls onto his bed lifeless. The queen rushes in and at last touches and holds her son, but he is dead. Up in the window of the bedroom, the figures of the swan and the prince appear, the swan carrying the prince in his embrace. The final line on the New Adventures website page about the plot synopsis says this: "The battle, whether real or of the mind, is now over." And it is this sentence on which I'm going to base the rest of this video essay, because that's the question I've always been left with. What really happened? And that is what I'm going to let you decide. I'm going to describe 3 different versions or interpretations of this story, and I'm going to let you pick. And by the end of it, maybe I'll have decided as well. Who knows? As I'm going through each of these scenarios, there are some key moments I'm going to be focusing on. The first one is the relationship between the prince and his mother. The second one is the moment with the swans at the lake. The third one is going to be the stranger. The fourth one is the swans fighting, both the prince and amongst themselves. And the fifth one is the ending. Alright then, let's dive into scenario number 1. Version 1. Everything is real. Drawing on the original versions of this story, so the first ballets and the old folk tales, the swan is a maiden put under a spell, transformed into a swan, who can only become a maiden again at night by the lake. Bouncing off this then, while Matthew Bourne does like to tweak and twist the classics, I think in this case we might be allowed to base a lot of it on the original version. We can assume the swan to be both a real swan and potentially a human as well. Possibly under an enchantment, possibly just able to transform into a swan, sort of Marauders style, or under some horrific curse, that kind of thing. But backing up a little then, let's look at the rest of the story before we reach the swan. Assuming everything is real actually makes this pretty straightforward. So the prince is alone and lonely, longing for care and physical touch. His mother, the queen, neglects him in this way, and after years of isolation, despite being in the public eye, the prince is wooed by a girl in pink and finally doesn't feel quite so alone. The trip to the theatre plays out, the queen disapproves, and the prince is left alone again and saddened. His mother denies him affection once more, and the prince drinks heavily and runs off to Swank Bar. There he sees his girlfriend dancing with other men and gets into a fight. He's thrown out and photographed, and then he heads to the lake. This is the moment where things change, for lack of a better word. So the swan is real. Creature and human, able to transform into a human. Possibly all the other swans can transform as well. Maybe they are all under the same spell, or maybe it's just him. So either by a curse or by his own will, the swan is a swan when we first meet him. While in swan form, he sees the prince and rushes to stop him. This is hinted at in the show because when we first see the swan going drifting across the lake, he's very serene and peaceful, but he rushes in immediately when the prince is wading out to end his life. This time, the swan we see as urgent, and even the moves themselves seem to say, "Don't do it." Then, hesitant to allow a stranger to get too close, again possibly because of the curse or spell, or as a creature he knows he may be easily hurt by a human, or just because the swan is as touch-starved as the prince is and feels wary of anyone else. The swan swims around the prince, engaging with him but keeping at that distance. As the night carries on, he keeps returning to the prince, who follows the swan as well, each making sure the other is alright, particularly the swan checking on the prince. Soon they do grow closer, and as the moon shines overhead, the pair finally touch. This might be the moment where the swan transforms into a human, or he may have transformed earlier under the moonlight, and this touch could mean something else, but we'll dive into that a little bit later on. So either because he can, or because the spell lifts while it's nighttime, the swan is now a human. Possibly meeting your true love or being touched by your true love could have something to do with it, or it could just be that he now trusts the prince enough to let him close. They then talk and get to know each other, growing even closer. They probably share stories. The swan probably asks why the prince wanted to end his life, and the prince will tell him. Perhaps they can both relate. Maybe they both have an absence of touch and care and that presence in their lives. Maybe the swan is the only transformed human. Maybe the others are true swans, and so he never felt like he could be close to them. Maybe they don't trust him. They allow him to be on their lake and within their ranks, but there's still that distance, that distrust between them. That would explain a lot. So both are isolated and feel alone in their own ways. They bond, they get closer together, they start to fall in love. Perhaps like in the original versions of this story, the swan can be freed from his spell if someone who has never loved before proclaims their love for him. The sun, though, begins to rise, and so the two are parted. The swan maybe has to return to the lake, transforming back into the swan, or perhaps he wants to transform if he's not under a curse, that kind of thing. Maybe he is so animalistic now that his nature is to just transform and go back to the lake after a while. So as the swans disappear back into the water, the prince is once again left alone, but this time he is happy, he is thrilled, he finally has felt that comfort, that touch, and he's overjoyed. He dances around the lake, tears up the suicide note, and runs back home to the palace. From here, we have a couple of different routes the story could go down. Assuming that everything is real, this means the stranger is also real. On the other hand, while still being real, if we draw from the original source material again, the stranger could be real, but it's not the swan, it's an evil doppelganger. This person being sent by the evil sorcerer, who in this version I cannot help but see as anyone other than the private secretary. I mean, just look at the guy. He clearly gives off evil sorcerer vibes. If he could have evil magic, he would do it. Possibly trying to keep the swan as a swan, making sure the enchantment doesn't break, trying to trick the prince into declaring love for someone else or just go mad. Any of those things, that's what's happening there. Going back though to the stranger being the swan, it's real, it's him, he's there. Why did it go wrong? Why is the stranger, the swan, being cruel? What happened there? Well, to explain this in the everything is real scenario, I'm going to look at things from the swan's point of view. I think that in this scenario, the swan might be feeling a bit used. He of course saved the prince's life, and they grew close enough, and he trusted the man to be intimate with him. Maybe that touch, as I mentioned before, was more than just a touch. As I mentioned earlier, I said we'd come back to that touch moment. Maybe the touch was the ultimate touch. Maybe it was metaphorical symbolism for them sleeping together that night. He allowed the prince to be so close to him, he felt like he was falling in love, and he had transformed back into a human, and those two were intimate and made love by the side of the lake. The entire beautiful duet between them does get closer and closer as it goes on, so you could definitely read it that way. So if, in this scenario, the swan fell in love with the prince, maybe hoping to break the spell, but also just so delighted to be in love, finally having someone to be close to, much like how the prince felt, and then they sleep together, they have this beautiful moment, but then the swan has to transform back into a swan and return to the lake, what happens next? Well, he's been forced to transform back into a swan, return to the water, and then he looks across to the bank and sees the prince dancing around and kissing some random woman who's come to the park to feed the swans. Now, this thoughtless, carefree moment that seems so whimsical to us watching from the audience, imagine the swan seeing that. I don't think he would quite know how to feel, and there will be no way to ask because he's had to transform back into a swan again. And so he has to wait until the following night when he can become a human again, and then what's he gonna do? What's the only thing he can do? What's the only choice he has? The prince hasn't returned to the lake, so what can he do? Pursue him, of course. So he goes to the palace, but having no invitation, he has to scale the wall, which is why he appears balancing along it. He hasn't been properly human around society for so long. Of course he behaves strangely. Of course he isn't dressed right. Of course people look at him because he is strange. He may have been a swan for a really, really long time. He might have been a swan all his life under this enchantment. And so the behavior begins to make sense now as well. He's not used to being a human or around many other humans. So of course, that attention is going to immediately be on him. But when he sees the prince, things do not go as he hoped. Maybe he saw the prince with the girlfriend and gets even more hurt and confused. And then when they finally see each other and lock eyes, the prince turns to look at him. He looks almost horrified. That's not the reaction you would want from the person you think you've just fallen in love with. It looks, probably to the swan, like the prince is almost revolted, horrified, and doesn't want to remember their night together. And what do animals do when they feel attacked or uneasy? They go on the defensive or attack themselves, and that's exactly what the stranger does. He sets about getting all of the attention in some of the worst ways, but he is hurt and angry. This, of course, pushes the prince further away, which will make the swan feel like it's confirmation. The prince doesn't want me, he's denying me, he's pushing me away, he doesn't want me. And he probably starts to believe that to the prince, he is nothing. Their night together meant nothing. The prince is not in love with him as he was led to believe. Communication clearly went completely out of the window with these two, but one of them is a very sheltered and upset royal, and one of them has been a swan for most of his life, so we can forgive them. Then the prince demands the stranger's attention, and for one shining moment, literally because the stage clears of everyone else and the lighting changes for them, they are reunited. They are both animalistic now. Desire and love and hurt and confusion all bubbles up as they talk and dance together and touch, and maybe, just maybe, it can all be all right again. But then the swan does something which breaks it. This is hinted at the climax of their tango. The swan is gripping tight to the prince, around the shoulder and the throat from behind. Maybe he's demanding answers or a choice, a declaration of love right there. Perhaps, tell me that you love me, help break the spell, just tell me that you love me. But it's too much, and the prince pulls away, turning. Though he seems to wish that he could give the swan what he's asking for, and it's shown in his embracing the empty air where the stranger's arms were. But possibly it's too much for him. Maybe he fears the scorn of his mother and the other royal guests, again leaning into the LGBT part of the story. This is his sexuality he's dealing with. And so, angry and hurt once again, the stranger departs. The swan is destructive now. And again, animalistic rage flares in him. He, after all, let this man in, allowed him so close he could hurt him, thought he was falling into true love, perhaps finally hoping to break that spell. And now he gets denied. That has to hurt. So he becomes destructive. He dances with the queen, he taunts the prince, eventually drawing the black mark down his face, a reminder of who he is, what they were to each other. The prince might also be seeing this through jealous and confused eyes, making the swan's behavior seem even worse. But assuming that everything is real, the swan/stranger could be seen to be acting out of spite and hurt feelings. Then, of course, the prince sees his mother desire the stranger, his swan. And this must feel like everything is spiraling and repeating. His mother denies him touch and affection, but will shower it on a string of lovers, and now she would share it with the one person he thought he could love. And it seems to him that the swan is going to abandon him as well and become another one of his mother's affairs. This breaks the prince's heart, and in rage, he aims a gun at his mother. His terror, his hurt, leading him to believe that killing her could end his pain. But the private secretary shoots first, killing the girlfriend, who, despite everything, probably feels responsible for the prince's emotional state, rushes in to help, and gets herself killed in the process. This changes a little bit if the swan is not the stranger, but it's an evil double. This would mean that again, it's all real, but the stranger is deliberately trying to make the prince go insane, with jealousy, worry, doubt, and hurt. This is hinted at when the stranger and the private secretary seem to share a look of knowing when he takes the ash to smudge the black mark down his forehead. Mocking and cruelty in this version would make perfect sense too. In the end, the result is what they wanted. The prince is locked away, unable to return to the lake, the swan, or anything. If it's a curse, it cannot be broken, and the sorcerer wins. Back to the story then. So the prince is sent to the asylum where he is treated and has drug-addled visions of his mother tormenting him. But then the swans come to him, and they are angry and violent. Perhaps they heard the swan's side of the story and are enraged on his behalf, or perhaps they do not trust humans and wish to sever the pair. They hiss and maybe essentially give the prince a warning to leave the lake and the swan alone. The prince tries to catch them, maybe seeking to send a message to the swan with them, but they leave. The swan himself then emerges, transformed back into human form once again, and he's been wounded. This could be from fighting the other swans, perhaps they don't want the pair together, he could have been hurt by the sorcerer, or perhaps he was just hurt from climbing up to get into this asylum to try to get back to the prince. The pair finally have a loving reunion, embracing, apologizing, but then the swans return again. Maybe they're sent on the bidding of the sorcerer, or maybe it's of their own volition. Either way, they attack, and the prince seems to perish. This causes the swan to cry out, his heart breaking. The prince is not quite dead yet though, and he rises, caught by the relieved swan, and again they embrace, the swan carrying him in his arms. Then the end comes. The swans attack again, and this time the swan is torn apart, trying to protect the prince, and as the prince screams, the second heart breaking now, the swans see that he is dying, and they leave. The prince dies of a broken heart and is finally reunited with the swan in the afterlife. This is seen in the window at the end where the swan is holding and cradling the prince in his arms. So that is option scenario 1. Everything was real. Let's move on now to option number 2. Once again, a quick content and trigger warning because this version gets a lot darker because this is the successful suicide version. So if you do not want to hear about that, skip this video right now. 3, 2, 1, let's carry on. Version number 2, a suicide. This one starts roughly the same as scenario 1 with everything being real until we reach the lake. In this version, the prince succeeds. He is rejected, hurt, lost, denied at every turn, and after being thrown out of Swank Bar, he knows at last what he wants. He wants out. He writes a suicide note and leaves it pinned with chewing gum to a lamppost. And then he wades out into the lake to end his suffering and his life. Then he goes under. The last thing the prince sees may be a flock of swans out on the water. One might swim closer, inspecting him. From this point on, the rest of the show is a vision, concocted by his drowning mind, a culmination of his hopes, his fears, his memories, and his dreams. As he struggles for air, he imagines the swans coming closer. He reaches for one, the swan, who he imagines dancing with him. Maybe he imagines the swan transforming into a human. He imagines them growing close, and finally he has the comfort and closeness he's desired all his life. As that imagined joy floods him, he imagines leaving the lake, returning home, attending the ball. Then the visions begin to turn. The pain is taking over. Drowning is not silent. It's not peaceful after all. It hurts. It burns. It's killing him. And as it claws and burns, so do the visions in his mind turn nasty with the pain. He imagines the stranger, cruel and mocking. He imagines losing this new and only hope to his mother, to be denied again. The gunshot is his final gasp underwater, the final beat of his heart. The asylum is the madness of dying. final thoughts whirling as he sinks and his body begins to shut down. The water and moonlight make a kaleidoscope of colours and imagined visions. Finally, he imagines his mother actually caring, crying, running to his dead body. And as he passes away, one of the swans dives under the surface of the water, looking down at him, and he imagines being carried away into a great beyond by a creature who actually cares for him. If we look at some other versions of the ballet, we can see some versions of this theme shining through. In the 1966 Vienna State Ballet, the prince drowns in a storm created by the evil Rothbart. In 1988, the Dutch National Ballet showed the prince drowning himself after failing to save a debt, his body later being found by one of his friends. In 2006, the Houston Ballet had the prince shoot a crossbow at Rothbart, but hitting a debt instead, then carrying her body into the lake where he drowned himself. And in 2012, the Blackpool Grand Theatre version had the prince dragging Rothbart down into the lake with him, drowning them both and ending the curse. And that last one is the one I'm going to focus on, because in this version, we could see Rothbart as the prince's mental state. His depression, his hurt, his confusion, everything boiling up. And so the symbolism of him dragging this down into the lake with him would mean he was killing Rothbart, killing his unhappiness, ending that curse. And while it's awful, it is also beautifully poetic. Let's move on then to scenario number 3. Version 3. Nothing is real. This scenario I'm calling The Descent into Madness, and yes, it keeps making me think of American McGee. Perfect. And this one starts in pretty much the same way as the other two. The prince is lonely and alone, unhappy and isolated, presumably after the loss of his father and his mother's denial and rejection, and this means his mind has already started to spin and deteriorate. He sinks into his nightmares and his dreams from a young age. His mother takes many lovers and gives him a poor role model of what romantic love and relationships look like. He begins to exist in a sort of limbo between imagination and reality, and he finds it hard to distinguish sometimes between the two. He cannot express emotion, and every day feels like a repeat, the same stagnant, lonely toil over and over. He dreams of a swan creature who is sometimes kind and sometimes cruel, but the prince doesn't care. Just as long as he's feeling something, feeling hated and anger, feeling loved, anything, he will take it because it's better than the nothing he receives every day in reality. As he grows into a young man, the prince is expected to get a partner. Then into his life waltzes a pretty girl clad in pink. She pursues him, she seems excited, and most importantly, she touches him. She is free with it, grabbing his arm, dancing with him. This is a jolt to the system, and he latches on, possibly too much. This version of the girlfriend was possibly sent by the private secretary, either to drive more of a wedge between him and the queen, gaining the private secretary favour or something, or maybe to cause a scandal. The prince enjoys the thrill of the closeness, and though the queen does not approve, he continues to see the girlfriend. But the theatre trip goes horribly wrong, and his mother denies him comfort again. The prince drinks heavily, goes out to Swank Bar, and in this version of the story, the girlfriend is also there, but maybe she isn't. Either way, he thinks he sees her dancing with other men, the private secretary might be there too, and maybe the girlfriend being used by him, he sees her being given money, or imagines he sees her being given money. He then gets angry, into an altercation, and thrown out of the bar. At this point, the prince believes his whole life has been a lie. His girlfriend was paid to date him, or was dating him just for her own gain in social standing or something. His mother doesn't show him any care, he is beloved by a public, but he is shunned by his only family. He feels broken and betrayed to his core, and in his cracking mind, he sees a vision of a swan soaring away. He follows, gets to the park, and reaches the lake. Once again, deciding what he wants to do, he leaves a note and wades out into the water. In doing so, he disturbs a flock of swans. As he watches them, their heads turn, and maybe standing waist deep, the prince continues to look at them. And then he imagines them dancing, and one swan maybe turns into a human, or maybe remains a swan, but in the visions, he and the swan dance and bond, and he finally feels a sense of that closeness he has longed for all his life. Maybe he imagines the entire story, like the original story, imagining some evil sorcerer and a curse put on this creature. He may imagine falling in love with the swan, getting close to the creature. He imagines everything he has ever wanted, everything he's ever longed for. And then, believing what he imagined to be real, he leaves the lake and runs home, feeling happy and elated. This, of course, will make the people around him in the palace confused. He'll be behaving in a manner that isn't like him, so happy and jubilant. Maybe he's even talking about the swans. And he starts to worry them. This pushes them further away, and then he sees this and it pushes him further away as well. The queen, the royal advisors, everyone is looking at him like he's strange, because to them he is. He's suddenly bouncing and happy and jubilant, talking about a swan? Swans at the lake? He seems like he's going mad, and possibly the private secretary will encourage this rumour, perhaps for his own gain. Then the royal ball happens, and while many possible suitors for the prince are there, and so is the girlfriend, the prince is uninterested in any of them, still obsessing over the swans. The private secretary may be spreading this news, encouraging the rumours that the prince is unfit to rule, that he is mad, etc. Maybe that is his ultimate aim, to marry the queen and to rule, or just to get chosen as the successor after the prince is declared unfit, or maybe he just likes chaos. The arrival of the stranger in this scenario could go in two ways. One, it's a real guest. Maybe they're behaving a bit wildly, and the prince projects this vision of the swan onto them, and that's what he sees. The other option is, the stranger doesn't exist at all. There are hints of this in the show. At one point, after dancing with the stranger, the prince is left grappling with empty air. This could be read as him having imagined the man completely. The visions continue then, either wholly imaginary or the prince pressing these hallucinations onto a guest, and he grows more unstable. Another hint that the stranger could be completely imaginary is that he is dressed in a very similar way to the prince. Everyone else attending this event is in tailcoats, big fancy costumes, but those two are the only ones in long black coats. This could be a sort of mirroring of the prince, imagining a mirrored version of himself, a warped sort of take on that evil twin, that kind of thing. A reflection of what love seems to be to him based on his mother's affairs and rejections. A cruel mirror. As the stranger, the prince imagines, continues to get increasingly closer to the queen and everyone else, the prince imagines the ultimate moment of mocking, of taunting. The stranger sweeping a black mark down his forehead, confirming in the prince's breaking mind that this is the swan, and he is being laughed at. He goes to get the gun and aims it at the stranger and his own mother in confused fury and hurt. And now, here the paths could splinter off again in a few directions. Option 1. The stranger is just a guest, the private secretary shoots and kills the girlfriend. Option 2. The stranger is just a guest, but the prince shoots, possibly injuring or killing his own mother. Option 3. The stranger is not real at all, and the private secretary shoots, killing the girlfriend. Option 4. The stranger is not real at all, and the prince shoots, possibly wounding or killing his mother. And option 5, which I think I like the best. The stranger is not real, and neither is the girlfriend. She has never been real. She was completely imagined, conjured up by the prince in his desperation for some form of comfort and touch, and that is why the queen was behaving so strangely towards her. That was why she didn't like her and seemed to disapprove, because the prince was introducing her to thin air. In this version, the private secretary shoots and wounds or kills the prince. If the prince dies in this moment, then the rest of the show is a dying vision seen by his brain. He could also have shot and injured or killed his own mother as well. If the prince survives this, then we move into the asylum, which may be exactly what the private secretary wanted all along. Or it's not, and his seemingly sinister intentions were all just perceived wrongly by the prince's breaking mind. At this point, perhaps even the queen's visit is a hallucination, especially if she is dead. The nurses with her face, everything, it could all just be visions swimming in his troubled mind. So, the prince's mind fractures. He imagines the swans coming again, and their anger is partly anger at himself and partly what he thinks he deserves, maybe guilt and grief. When the swan himself emerges wounded, it's a manifestation of the prince's wounded psyche. He is broken and destroyed, and as the swan tries to protect him, he spirals. The swan is destroyed, and the prince either dies or completely falls into madness, his world becoming hallucinations with no escape. But hold your horses, because that is not where things end. There is another version of the nothing was real story. Bear with me here. Scenario 3.5. Nothing was real, and we mean nothing. The prince was never a prince. He has been in the asylum this entire time. Now, there are hints that this could be true, because the prince's bedroom at the beginning of the show is very white. It is exactly like the asylum at the end. He even wears white pajamas, has white bed sheets. The way that his mother engages and interacts with him, it would all start to make sense. Imagine then that his mother is not his mother. She is a doctor or a nurse. The private secretary too, the staff, everyone, they are all staff in the asylum. That would explain completely why none of them touch him, hug him, give him comfort. Maybe the prince is also dangerous, and so they absolutely cannot get near him, and anytime he tries to get near them, they draw back because he is dangerous. So, existing for such a long time in this asylum, the boy conjures up a new reality to disappear into. And it starts as a fantasy. He is a prince in a palace, but it turns dark and it turns sad. So if all he's ever known has been doctors and treatments and no real care or touch, how could he imagine what that would be like? Instead of a happy daydream fantasy, the characters treat him poorly. The nurses and doctors who become his mother and the royal court and the private secretary give him no love or care or comfort. He has it all. He is a prince in the limelight, but still he's lonely and alone. Maybe because he knows nothing of what that is like, even in his dreams, and he cannot comprehend it. The turmoil of the girlfriend, the betrayal, the attempt to end his life, they could all be a part of the dream and hallucination too. Reimagining his reality to fit this warped world. Maybe he tries to end his life in the asylum as well, but is stopped or brought back by the doctors. The swan is his only grasp at love. But that too crumbles because he cannot comprehend happiness. He's never seen it, never felt true love. The swan turns cruel as the stranger in his mind, and the doctors and nurses continue to treat him. He falls further into despair and hurt visions. Maybe the gun is real, or it's a kind of weapon he finds, or just his fists in the asylum. Maybe that is him attacking one of the doctors or another patient. He would then have to be restrained as he imagines the girlfriend being shot, imagines being thrown into the asylum, perhaps in a moment of lucidity there, and then his swan is destroyed too. All parts of his breaking and cracking mind trying to cope with where he is, but coming up with nothing. Because when you have no concept of what real love and comfort feels like, how could you even imagine it? In this version of the story, the finale could be symbolic of the prince in the asylum being sedated or dying for real. Perhaps even to end his suffering and end the danger to everyone around him, he's put to death. Well then, that was not cheery at all, but at this point, it's over to you. What do you think? Which version of this story do you believe? Or do you believe sort of lots of different bits from all of them that you smushed together? Let me know in the comments what you think. For me, I'm still not completely sure. Every time I think about this show or I watch this show, I almost change my mind. But I think overall I would have to say I lean towards the everything is real scenario, mostly because I am a sucker for a tragic romance. You guys know me. But overall, I really enjoy all these different versions. They are horrible, don't get me wrong, some of them, but I think they are beautifully poetic and poignant, and you can draw on things and moments from the show to back up and give you evidence for believing any of them. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. My biggest thought, though, is that no matter how the story goes, no matter what the reality is, I believe that the prince and the swan do find happiness and peace at the end of it. Thank you for watching, my wonderful jelly spoons. Thank you for sticking with me to the end of what is probably quite a long video. When I wrote this out, it was 6,000 words, so yep, probably going to be a long one. Sorry to editing me. I hope you're having a good time with that. I've got some sources and resources as well. God, sources and resources. I will link them down below so you guys can look at the interview with Matthew Bourne that I looked at, the various different bits of the company, some different versions of Swan Lake, all the different information, that kind of thing, popping it down below. If you'd like to watch the video about me making my swan legs, or indeed any of my other Matthew Bourne costumes, click on various things that'll be around the screen. And I've got a playlist on this channel which is called Making Costumes Until Someone Hires Me. In there you can probably find all of the costume videos as well. All right, I will see you again on Friday when we do the next part of the improvised OC story with little Doonup and his adventures. If you want to check that one out, come and see us on Friday. And I've got loads of other videos all around the channel as well if you want to see me making things, discussing things, creating stories, all that kind of thing. There's loads of theatre as well. I made a Pirates of the Caribbean musical. That one is still one of my favourite videos. Go and check that one out. So anyway, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for engaging with my content, and I will see you very, very soon. Let me know your thoughts down below, and mwah, goodbye. And where the fuck am I? Or it could go down. That's not the sentence I meant to say. Hello. Here's a light. No. Ah!